And it will be when you come to the land. Asher Hashem Elokecha nosen l'chon nachlo l'rishto, b'rishto. You come to the land which God has given to you as a portion, and you will inherit it. You will conquer it. You shavtabo, and you will set in the land. So Rashi makes it a point that in regard to the laws of Truma Meiser, the first tithing that you give to the Kohen, the 10%, that was immediate upon entry into the land. The obligation of challah, that when you take any of the 5 grains and you make dough, you have to tithe the bread. But in regard to Bikurim, the bringing of the first fruits that ripen or the first grains that ripen is only after you've conquered the land and divided the land, which each person has his own portion. What's the difference? As we'll see in a moment. Let's see Rashi. They were not obligated in the Bikurim to bring the new fruits to the Temple Mount until they conquered it and they divided it, that each person gave his own portion. Of course, we'll see that one brings the Bikurim, one must make a declaration of appreciation for all that Hashem has given us and done for us, and the land, and this is the first of the fruits or the grains of the land that you gave us, meaning each person is in his individual portion. It's an expression of appreciation. That you give the Truma, the Torah says grain that grows in Israel, or certain fruits that grow in Israel, grapes, olives, must be tithed before you partake of them. 10% you must give to the Levi before you partake of it. That's unrelated to you having your individual portion. However, the mitzvah Bikurim is what's most precious to the farmer, the first fruits that ripen, which the farmer values to a great degree. What's most valuable, that's what you give to Hashem. You bring it as a gift to the Temple Mount, and you make a declaration, as we'll discuss in a moment what the declaration was. You recount what happened from Yaakov Avinu through going to Egypt, through the redemption, till finally we arrived, and this is the land, this is the fruit of the land that you have given us. So that expression of appreciation has no relevance until you've conquered it and you've divided the land, which each person has his portion. This is the produce of that land which I personally received. Challah, when you make the bread of the grains, the 5 grains, you have to tithe it to give it to the Kohen. That's like tithing the grain or the produce of Israel to give to the Kohen. So this obligation only comes about once you've conquered and you've divided. You must take the first of all the fruits of the earth, that you bring from your land, which God is giving to you, and you put it in the basket, and you will go to the location which God has chosen that his name should dwell there. Meaning wherever the Shekhinah is. So originally it was the Mishkan Shiloh, and eventually it was the Beis HaMikdash. Let's see Rashi. Merashis lo korashis. It says of the first, but not every first produce. Shein kol haperus chayim b'bikurim. All produce, one is not obligated to give the first of those that ripen. Ela shivas haminim b'lavod. The 7 species which we identified is the land of Israel with, only those 7 species. How do we know this? Nemekan eretz, the nemelalon eretz chitu sora. Says when it identifies the very species of Israel, it delineates what they are. Mal halon mishiv saminim, shnishtabcho ben eretz Israel, avkan shevach Eretz Yisrael, Shein Shivas Aminim, the praiseworthiness, the uniqueness of the land of Israel, which is the 7 species. Zay Shemen. What is Zay Shemen? That's one of the species. Zais Agurei, Sheshamno Oga B'tocho, means an olive that's filled with oil. Oil is got dvash. Dvash can mean one of two things, either bees' honey, or dvash can mean date nectar. It means a ripened date. Udvash tmorim. Now, how does one begin this procedure? May rashis odom yored tosadeu. Person goes into his field, veroa teina shebichro, and he sees a fig has ripened. Korech le'gomi l'simen. He takes a piece of resinous material and he wraps it around that fruit and he identifies it that this is the first of the fruits that has ripened. The omer harezu bikurim, and he says this is bikurim, the first of the fruits. Now the word bikurim comes from the word bechor. Bechor is a firstborn. Bikurim means of the first fruits. So the first fruits that ripen, you identify with a piece of resinous material, and now when it grows, you know that is the first fruit that began to ripen. In today's Gemara above Mitzvah, we're going to see that the laws of Bikurim have the identical laws as the Truma. Just as Truma, the only person who's permitted to eat Truma is the Kohen or his family. Identically, Truma, Bikurim, which is the first, only the Kohen and his family are permitted to eat it. A non-Kohen, a Levi, an ordinary Yisrael, is not permitted, not in Truma, not in Bikurim. Chalo, when you tithe the bread, the tithing of the bread is referred to as what? As chalo. How does the Torah refer to challah? As reishis harisosechem, the first of your batter. When you tithe the batter, when you make a batter, the first of that batter is called challah. That challah has the same status as what? As truma. So we have truma is only unique to the Kohen. Bikurim, which is the first of the fruits that ripen, is unique to the Kohen, and the challah, which is reishis harisosechem, the first of your batter, is also unique to the Kohen and his family. A non-Kohen is not permitted to eat it. If the non-Kohen eats it, he has liability of spiritual excision, every one of these things. Now, it's interesting. There's a Rabbeinu Bachya, in the introduction to Parshas Bikurim, this portion, he always begins with a concept. Usually he quotes a verse initially, and that's how we introduce into Parsha. So if we read, as we read a little further, you take the first of your fruits, and who do you designate it for? You designate it for God. And to where do you take it? You take it to the Beis HaMikdash, which is the chosen location. It's the most special location in the world, the holiest location in the world. So you take the first of the fruits for God to the location which is Reishis, which is the choicest, and you give it to the Kohen, who's a representative of God, who's the most elite of the Jewish people, the Kohen. The Kohen is the lead of the elite. The tribe of Levi never participated in the Chet Egel, so they were not tainted with idolatry, and the Kohen is the elite of the elite. So that's the ultimate Reishis. So Rabbeinu Bachya says, you take the Reishis for the Reishis, you take the first of the fruit for Reishis, for God, who's the beginning of everything. Of course, creation is ex nihilo, so God is everything emanates from God, to the location which is Reishis, to the location which is the chosen, the most special, to the Kohen who's Reishis. And then he sums it up. You take the Reishis for the Reishis to the location Reishis and give it to the Reishis who's God's representative. That's Rabbeinu Bachya's words. But what's being said now? Why is the Truma not permitted to a non-Kohen? Even if a Kohen wants to share his Truma with a person who's not a Kohen, eating wise, is not permitted to eat it. A Levi receives the Meiser. Levi receives 10%. If the Levi chooses to give his Meiser, with his tithe, the tithe that's given to him to an ordinary Jew, he's permitted. It has no innate Kedusha. There's nothing holy about it, except that percentage has been given to the Levi. But there's innate Kedusha to the first of the tithing of the grain. There's innate Kedusha to the Bikurim, and there's innate Kedusha to the Challah. The first, when you tithe the batter, that's Reisha versus Echem. And every one of them, what's the common characteristic of every one of them? Reishis. It's the first. Now, anything which reflects, now, before the Chet Egel, who was meant to be the Kohen? The Kohanim were meant to be the Bechorim. The firstborn were meant to be the Kohanim. We find that an animal, a kosher species, a domesticated animal, the first issue of its womb, a sheep, a goat, a cow. What's the status of the first issue of its womb? And that's Kedushas Bechora. The person who owns that animal doesn't even have to consecrate it. Normally, an animal to take on the status of a consecrated status has to be consecrated by the owner of that animal. The first issue of a sheep, a goat, a cow is naturally consecrated. It's called Kedushas Bechor. That animal has to be brought as a shlomim, equivalent of a peace offering. That's what it is. But it was never consecrated. So the reason why it does not be consecrated, because the Torah says it's called Peter Rechem. It's the animal that opened the womb of its mother. It's the first issue of the womb. So again, Bechor, in regard to the animal of the kosher species, also has that characteristic of being the first. So we find anything that has this characteristic identification of first, it assumes that special, unique, reserved status that it's not available to everyone. What's the reason? The reason is because anything which reflects Hashem's characteristic or identification of the first assumes that level of Kedusha. As God himself is the first, everything emanates from him. Anything which reflects the Reishis also assumes that similar status, which it's off limits only to a person who has the status of Reishis. Klal Yisrael, the first few words in the Torah, it says, Bereishis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So Rashi cites Chazal, the word Bereishis. What does the word Bereishis mean? It should be read Bishvil Reishis. For the sake of Reishis, God created heaven and earth. What's Reishis? For the sake of Torah, which is referred to as Reishis, it's the first, it's the most special. And for Klal Yisrael, what you call Reishis. We are called, Rashi cites a pasuk, we call Reishis to us, it's like the first of the wheat. Therefore, so we find Klaus also has the status of Reishis. However, when we speak about these various tithes, these various things, it's the ultimate Reishis. Who's the ultimate? The lead of Reishis. The lead of Reishis is the Kohen. He's the chosen of the chosen. Being the chosen of the chosen, only he has the right to partake of this because he shares that characteristic with God himself. So it's the Truma, it's the Bikurim, it's the Challah, and it's the Bechor of the animal, which is the first issue of the womb of the sheep, the goat, and the cow. That's the reason. That's the concept. So now it's something very interesting now. The law is that if you have untied grain of these various species, which are the species of Israel, and you eat them before the tithe, what's the liability? Liability is kares. You're not permitted. You're not permitted to partake of it because Torah says until it's tithe, the grain or the fruit is off limits to you. That's what the Torah says. So there's a Rashi in Yevomis that says, why? Why does it carry such a serious level of liability? So Rashi says that because what is tevel. Tevel is untithed grain, because tevel itself, within tevel lies truma, which hasn't yet been taken. And since the truma hasn't yet been taken, when you eat the tevel, you eat this untithed grain, you're actually eating truma. So if you eat truma, the liability is what? Is koris. So Tosas asks on Rashi, but if that is the case, that the basis for liability is because truma is intermingled in this grain or in this fruit. So if a Kohen who's permitted to eat truma, so why when he eats the untithed grain or the untithed fruit, why should he be liable for koris? If the basis for the liability is because truma is intermingled in that untithed grain or untithed fruit, so if a Kohen eats it, a Kohen's permitted in truma, he should not be subject to this level of liability. That's Tosas' question on Rashi. And therefore Tosas learns it's what we call a divine decree. You're not permitted to eat it until you tithe it. So with this understanding, we're able to understand Rashi. Why is the truma permitted to the Kohen? Why? Factually speaking, before the truma is tithed, untithed grain, truma is intermingled in there. Truma is not permitted to anyone. However, when truma assumes the characteristic of rashis, which the Kohen shares that characteristic, now it becomes permitted. So it's only once it's tithed, when it becomes tithed, now it enters into the domain of the Kohen. Until it's tithed, it doesn't enter into the domain of the Kohen. So therefore, if the Kohen eats the untithed grain or fruit, what is the basis for the liability? Because within that mixture lies truma. But the Kohen's permitted truma. No. The Torah only permits truma to the Kohen when it assumes that characteristic of rashis. The Kohen it hasn't assumed that yet. If that's the case, it only it's when it enters into his domain. And because it hasn't entered into his domain, therefore he has that liability. But once it's tithed, and now what's his relevance to it? Because he shares that characteristic, now the truma is permitted to him because now it's rashis, which prior to that it wasn't, therefore he has that liability. What's the proof? Which to this point, the halacha is, if you take an esrog shel tevel, an esrog which has been tithed. Now the halacha is esrog. If you have an esrog which is owned by two people, it says ulakachtem lochem b'yom harishon. You have an esrog which is owned by partners. There's a partnership in the esrog. There's one fulfill his obligation of taking the four species with the esrog. There's a partnership in the esrog. So the halacha is no, you're not. You have to own that esrog fully. You have to have 100% ownership in that esrog. If you have any partner in its monetary value, one does not fulfill this obligation. Yet, Rashi says, according to one point in the Gemara, that even if the esrog is tevel, untithed, Rashi says one fulfills his obligation of esrog, which is tevel. Although you're not permitted to eat it, but yotzei, one fulfills his obligation. But the question is, but Rashi says that if esrog is an intermingling of truma and chulin, that within that untithed esrog lies truma, and truma belongs to the Kohen, so you have a partnership. So what's even the consideration that one fulfills the obligation of esrog if it's untithed? So that's a confirmation that Rashi understands that it only enters into the domain of the Kohen only once it's tithed, because that's when it assumes that characteristic of rashis. But until you do that tithing, it doesn't assume that characteristic of rashis. It doesn't enter his domain. So when does it become permitted to him? When it enters in his domain. So therefore, if you take the esrog before it's tithed, if you're of the opinion that it does not be edible, one can fulfill that obligation because monetarily it's fully yours and it's not intermingling of partnership. It's the one who owns it and it's the Kohen's domain. Therefore, that's a confirmation that Rashi is of the opinion that when does the Torah permit the Kohen to eat the truma? Only when it assumes the characteristic of rashis.